OCR History B, the Elizabethans, 1580 to 1603. This content video is on our fifth and final topic of the Elizabethans and the wider world. With why was there expansion? So why did Elizabeth want to potentially create an empire? So first of all, in the Middle Ages, travel had been very rare, dangerous, or people just didn't leave England. They travelled by land. However, this changes in the 15th century or the 1400s, where we see the first long sea voyages because of new navigational devices, for example, the compass. This led to faster and more manoeuvrable ships and the invention of guns for protection. Elizabeth encouraged these voyages because it could mean a more reliable source of luxury goods and could lead to finding gold and fame. So Elizabeth knew that if she sent explorers to raid different countries around the world, the likelihood was that they would find products which would be very valuable to her. In terms of naval power, as we know, we are an island and therefore a powerful navy has always been important as a good defence for us. So English sailors became much better at sailing and fighting at sea, and this didn't just improve trade and exploration, but it was also obviously vital when we defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. And by the end of Elizabeth's reign, England was the greatest sea power in the world. So obviously for such a small island, this would have been something that would have been impressive to many of the rulers around the world as well. And obviously we have a female at the head of England at this time. So this would have been extremely impressive. In terms of trade, in the 1550s, the cloth trade collapses, and this means the English need new markets for their goods, and they most importantly need new goods to sell. So new trade companies formed, including the Muscovy Company in 1555, which specialised in furs and timber, the Eastland Company in 1581, which specialised in timber and tar, the Levant Company in 1581, which specialised in dyes and dried fruit, wine and silk, and then finally the one you're most familiar with, which is the East India Company, which was made in 1600 and which traded silk, cotton, tea and spices. In terms of empire, Spain's wealth from the New World meant that Elizabeth was keen for overseas territory, so she sees the wealth that Spain has made and she's envious of that. She wants that too. So there were several attempts to establish overseas colonies during Elizabeth's reign, but none of them was successful. One of the most notable attempts was Roanoke, which we will speak about in just a moment. And finally, there was competition with Spain generally. So English adventurers, notably Sir Francis Drake, were devout Protestants and loathed the Spanish because they were Catholic. Drake set about trying to steal as much gold as he could and attack as many Spanish colonies as he could. Remember, we know that Sir Francis Drake was known as El Drac, the dragon, and was also labelled a pirate. And despite this, Elizabeth supported Drake's effort hugely in the hope that England would gain more wealth and more power. So in terms of imperial ambition, Elizabeth's desire for an empire, the motivations really for this was that she wanted to spread the word of God, she wanted to spread Protestantism. Remember, she's pretty much an isolated Protestant country, other than some people in the Netherlands who support her. She wants bases to attack Spanish ships. Remember, the Spanish are setting up globally. They already have an empire that Elizabeth is very envious of. And she wants a global reputation. She wants to improve the reputation of England worldwide. So we have John Dee, who wants to help her do this, and he's an advisor to the Queen. He presented a plan to shift the balance of power from Spain to England in 1577. He proposes ventures to the Far East and the East Indies, Spain, and Central and Southern America, and he also advises Elizabeth to set up colonies in North America as well. So the explorer that I'm sure you're most familiar with is Sir Francis Drake. He was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, which means to circle it, with John Hawkins, and was seen as a national hero. He was a sea captain, a privateer and a naval officer, and we know that he got under the skin of the Spanish because they nicknamed him El Drac, which is the dragon. They also labelled him as a pirate. So November 1577, he left Plymouth with 5 ships and 170 men. He plundered Spanish and Portuguese ships off West Africa and stole lots and lots of gold and jewels and goods from them, and becomes labelled, as we say, as a pirate by them. In the summer of 1578, he enters the Strait of Magellan and claims several islands for the Queen. He's the first Englishman into the Pacific, which is one of his greatest accomplishments. Winter 1578, he raids Chile and Peru and attacks Spanish treasure ships and seizes silver worth over £20,000. So again, good statistic for the exam, which reinforces the wealth and power that Drake is gaining for Elizabeth. In 1579, he lands in California and labels it New Albion for Elizabeth. In 1579, in September, he returns to England with all of his pillaged treasures for investors, the Queen and himself. And we can tell how pleased Elizabeth was because in April 1581, Drake is knighted by the Queen on his ship, the Golden Hind. So after looking at the success of Drake, and obviously if you had a question on success of explorers, Drake would be one of those explorers that we could say were successful. And we're going to have a look at a couple of less successful attempts. So we're going to start with Newfoundland. So Humphrey Gilbert, who was an English Protestant who had a real hatred for Catholic Spain, searched for a sea route around the top of North America to provide England with a trade route to China. But his first attempt in 1579 was a disaster. Only his younger half-brother Walter Raleigh made it across the Atlantic. Gilbert's second voyage in June 1583 was successful and he claimed Newfoundland, but he did not establish a colony as the land was barren, cold and food was scarce. So as a result of this, this is not a success. Gilbert drowns on his return home as well, so this is the end really of his search for colonies for Elizabeth. We also then have Walter Raleigh, who we have just mentioned is Humphrey Gilbert's half-brother, and he hoped that America would be a gateway to riches of Asia and also would be a good base to attack Spain from. So there is a charter to colonise land in America, and this states that Elizabeth would receive 1/5 of all the gold or the silver that he finds. So in April 1584, he sent 2 of his friends on vessels to North America, and they reached an island called Roanoke, which you might recognise the name of, where he made contact with the local Algonquian people, and Walter Raleigh believed this was a good place to establish an English colony. He names it Virginia after his virgin queen, Elizabeth, and Richard Hakluyt wrote a pamphlet outlining the benefits of colonising America, including the goods that were there, missionary work from a Protestant perspective, and being able to attack the Spanish. In terms of what happened at Roanoke, though, it's a bit of a mystery, and also it would be fair in the exam to write that this wasn't successful. So Walter Raleigh decided that he was going to stay with the Queen, and Richard Grenville and Ralph Lane led 600 sailors and soldiers to Roanoke. The journey was treacherous and Grenville spread from the group, and they arrive in July 1585. Much of the fleet had got stuck in the sandbanks, and this led to many supplies being lost. So straight away, the supplies that they had taken have been damaged or have been lost. They're not able to use them, and this leaves them being dependent on the Algonquian people, the natives, and this is going to cause a strained relation between the two straight away. So Grenville decides that he's going to return to England for supplies, and Lane decides that he's going to stay as a governor with 107 men. Unsurprisingly, the Algonquian people grew very weary and wary of the English, and they decide that they are not going to give the supplies that they have been providing the English with. So as a result of this, Ralph Lane preemptively attacked and killed indigenous people, so the original people, the Algonquians, because he's wary that they are going to attack them if he doesn't do it first. Drake has to then rescue the colonists in June 1586 because it is a disaster, and many return to England. Walter Raleigh then decides that he's going to send another group of colonists. So Governor John White returns to England, but when he returns to Roanoke in 1590, the colonists had all vanished. There was nothing there at all other than an inscription on a tree which read the word Croatoan. So this was a complete failure because they do not know what happened to these people when they had returned. The colony has not been established, but despite this, they have learnt a lot about the potential for future colonies. So Harriet and White's books informed colonisation in Jamestown in 1607, so it does form a basis for potential expansion in the future. But if you're going to reference Roanoke, you need to be saying that this was a failure to establish a colony for Elizabeth. Here we have trade with the East. So wealthy Elizabethans, such as the gentry, wanted goods from India and China, for example, silk, cotton, jewels, nutmeg, cinnamon, and cloves. All of these items would have been seen as extremely luxurious and an opportunity for any members of the gentry to show off at feasts or banquets that they were holding in their magnificent homes. So Elizabeth knew that there would be a very willing audience to buy as many of these products as possible. The Spanish-Portuguese War in 1580 had led to English merchants or traders creating the Turkey Company in 1581, and Elizabeth had granted them a monopoly, or remember sole trading rights, to trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we have Ralph Fitch as one of our explorers in the East, and the Turkey Company sent Fitch to India, Southeast Asia and China to research trade. He had carried letters from the Queen to the Mughal and the Chinese emperors. And on his journey, he learnt lots about the wealth and the trade of India, China, and the Spice Islands. So as much as he doesn't manage to establish a colony, the knowledge that he gains there is very beneficial for future explorers to establish a colony. He also writes about the people, the customs, and the goods, which again is invaluable information. And lots of merchants or traders in England were interested in the trade opportunities that Fitch described. Finally, we have the East India Company, which is established in 1600. So in April 1601, John Lancaster was given the command of the first East India Company fleet, and they established England's first trading post in the East in Java in 1602, which is a huge success and is going to enable the British to make lots of money. English ships began to bring home spices as the Portuguese and the Dutch had done, which again is something that Elizabeth and the gentry would benefit from massively. Lancaster's voyage from 1601 to 1603 is a very important moment in British history, and it really does signal the start of the British Empire, and John Dee's vision is clearly becoming a reality. 200 years later, the East India Company was still the biggest trading company in the world, which really does show its long-term success. So that concludes the Elizabethan content videos with our final video on the wider world. Just remember, for the wider world, a common essay question is the success and the failures of explorers, or the different motivations that they had. So things like power, wealth, trying to establish an empire with imperial ambition, etc. So I hope those have been helpful, and that concludes the Elizabethan content videos.